Deep Sea Embers Chapter 21 to 30. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 21 Inch's announcement. The ritual went smoothly. Now Duncan finally understood where the tragic murder scene in the cave had come from and what was going on with the crazy and evil deeds of these cultists. Then as he watched the masked priest approach himself with that sinister-looking dagger, a dark flame suddenly bursts forward and encapsulates that dark alloy. This striking supernatural phenomenon instantly roused the curiosity inside Duncan's heart. In his view, that dagger was most likely some sort of supernatural item as well, and perhaps this priest was also a special human, capable of harnessing said extraordinary powers like himself. Now that brought forward a new question: what sort of role do people like that play in a civilized society? As the blade struck down and stabbed into his chest, Duncan didn't flinch nor scream, only hearing a muffled noise of the rags being flayed by the metal. Thankfully, nothing burned inside of him. But not everything was fine and dandy at this moment. In the rear, where the totem stood, the flaming fireball had started to make a disturbing crackling sound like you would expect from a firework being doused with oil. The next thing Duncan knew, he had felt a touch reaching out at himself from the totem. It's filled with chilling madness, which he understood as a supernatural phenomenon, no doubt. The unexpected change in the symbolic sun immediately attracted the attention of the nearest believers, accompanied by several suppressed exclamations until the noise died down from the frenzy. Clearly this outcome was not normal for the ritual, because the two black hoods holding Duncan down had let go and got to their knees in fear. As for the masked priest, he was making a look of confusion with those eyes at the supposed sacrifice. Knowing the jig was up, Duncan rigidly formed a faint smile with those lips and touched the dagger that's currently stabbed into his chest. Next thing everyone knew, a wisp of ghostly green flame had popped into existence and wrapped around the blade. Almost instantly, Duncan got the feedback from the knife as he wanted, but in this case, it was weak and hollow like some sort of cheap counterfeit. Whatever power that's inside the blade wasn't of its own, but borrowed from something greater. Ads by PubFuture. But for Duncan, this discovery was enough. With a grin, he unhurriedly spoke in a frank manner: "I have two things to say." In the next instant, the priest felt the connection between himself and the obsidian knife being sidetracked by an external force until it was completely cut off. "First, I'm a man with a big heart, you see, this big. Already torn to begin with, but now even more ragged due to the dagger, Duncan stripped himself of the fabric hiding the gaping hollow hole in his chest." Through this grand reveal, the priest presiding over the sacrifice ceremony was clearly shocked and taken aback. "No-vel-b in .c ohm. Second, try to avoid offering expired food to your lord." With a gentle shove, Duncan forces the priest back with ease using this stiff shell of his. He didn't know why, but after wrapping the ghostly green flame around the dagger, the original owner appeared somehow weaker. As if coming back from his shock, the priest first flew into a panic, followed by a great deal of anger that caused his whole body to tremble. Pointing an accusing finger at the sacrifice, the masked priest roared, "This filth has come back from the dead. He's an undead. How dare a vile creature like you desecrate a holy ritual like this? Vile filth, which daring necromancer is responsible for this treacherous act?" "I don't understand what you're talking about," Duncan said casually as he glanced down at the obsidian knife. Once he got another faint feedback from the blade, a whimsical idea suddenly formed in his brain: "But I suddenly got a great idea to satisfy my curiosity." Ads by PubFuture. After saying this, he suddenly raised the obsidian knife and pointed it at the masked priest, raising that voice to a booming level so all of the black hoods could hear himself. "O Son God of the highest and most holy, please accept the sacrifice on this stage. I offer you the heart thy heart, and may you return from blood and fire." The next second, he saw the flames on the obsidian knife grow several folds, followed by the same cold maddening touch seeping out from the totem. Unlike the first round though, the target was instead the masked priest, which obviously knew what's going to happen next as he attempted to flee from the stage. However, the burning black knife of red and green flame flew straight out of Duncan's hand on its own and stabbed directly into the target's heart. With the latter issuing out a terrible scream, the cult leader's chest was directly pierced, and his heart was reduced to ash at that instant. Without effort, the blade promptly returned to Duncan's hand in the next, finally exhausting the last ounce of its remaining power. This ritual expected two individuals on this altar, one of whom must give up their heart as a sacrifice. Since he didn't have one to begin with on this shell, Duncan knew there could be only one other target, the priest himself, who actually had a heart. But never in his wildest dream did he expect things to work out so smoothly. Shooting a look towards the totem in the rear, Duncan slightly narrowed his eyes on the object and muttered his thoughts. Perhaps, it doesn't matter who is holding the dagger so long as the words are right. You will take them anyways, right? Of course, the fireball on the totem wouldn't answer his question, but the cultists around the altar had obviously reacted by flying into a huge panic. Many were screaming, but more were outraged at what just transpired, that it overshadowed the fear brought on by the death of their leader. Several cultists closest to the altar moved first, shouting the name of the sun god and rushing at Duncan with their weapons drawn. This ruined the plan Duncan had in mind. He intended to try another chant by saying, "I offer the hearts of everyone on the altar to the sun god," but when he saw that some of the cultists had brought out revolvers to shoot him, the idea was squashed. Giving these cultists the middle finger, he cuts off the projected state without a second of delay. Let these crazy people continue their crazy crap, I'm going back home to the vanished. At the same time, on the vast expanse of the sea, a rhythmic footstep echoed along the deck of the vanished. This was Alice, the puppet doll in her long Gothic dress, coming up to the captain's room. She wants to ask Duncan some questions, and she remembers well from the captain that he's in the room here. Alice has a good memory. Chapter 22 Inches Crew Members article. Stopping before the captain's quarters, Alice eyed the dark oak door in front of herself and noticed the scribble of words written on the frame, "Door of the Lost." It's not surprising to find such a sentence written on a ship like the Vanished, but Alice still frowned subconsciously. Not for the content though, but why she's able to recognize words in general. Alice had no memory of learning how to read. In fact, she did not have any memory of learning at all, nor did she remember where she had accumulated the experience of moving outside and talking to people. So, where does all this knowledge come from? A doll that's been sleeping inside a wooden coffin shouldn't know anything. Alice had never considered this question before until today, but somehow, after talking to Captain Duncan, the concept of curiosity somehow sprouted in the doll's mind, which was supposed to function peacefully forever without disturbance. Looking back carefully, this change seemed to have arisen after Duncan asked about the origin of the name, Alice. The doll didn't know whether this change was good or bad, but she didn't like the feeling of not knowing and being confused. Quickly shaking the discomfort aside, the doll adjusted her mentality and put her hand on the door handle to push it slightly. But the door didn't budge. Alice hesitated for a moment and tried again, but found the door unbudging like it's been molded out of pure steel. Then, just as she was about to try again, a voice suddenly came out of the captain's quarter, a hoarse, low voice, as if coming from a piece of decaying wood. "The door is open, lady." It wasn't Captain Duncan's voice, causing Alice to flinch back from startlement. However, she was able to regain herself quickly and tried again by pulling. This time it opened smoothly without resistance. Ads by PubFuture. It was only then that she remembered. The last time she was here, Captain Duncan had also pulled the door to open it for them both. It looks like life knowledge is still only knowledge, it's not actual experience. Reflecting on herself, Alice carefully probed her head into the captain's quarter to find it empty aside from the goat head statue on the mapping table. "Please come in, lady. The captain is busy, so you can wait for him here until he finishes." The goat head spoke more politely than Alice had imagined. "Also, try to avoid probing your head inside like this in the future. Other overly sensitive individuals on the Vanished will mistake the gesture as you hating them. Appeasing that bunch afterward will be troublesome, and what if your head falls off again? I don't have hands, so picking it up for you will be problematic." Really talked. This wood statue is really talking. Although Captain Duncan had mentioned before that the goat head on the mapping table could speak, Alice was stunned nevertheless to hear it for herself. Taking a moment before replying, "Okay, but my head won't actually fall off so easily. Also, didn't I manage to put it back on by myself?" "But wait, did you say overly sensitive ones? Are there others on the ship?" Alice quickly picked up on this point and grew both surprised and nervous all of a sudden. "Is that so strange to hear? It takes a lot of manpower to man a ship as big as this one. Do you think the great Captain Duncan would wash the deck by himself?" The goat head's explanation actually sounded reasonable. Although Alice felt something was wrong still with her not very bright head, she nevertheless nodded after a good minute. "What you said makes sense. So where are the others on the Vanished?" "There is only one loyal first mate of the captain, the rest are a bunch of guys with less brains than a rock, so you don't have to think about communicating with them. Also, They have no interest in communicating with people, the goat head interrupted her without waiting for Alice to finish. But considering that you are a newcomer to the ship, it is normal that there are many reasons and rules that you do not know. As Captain Duncan's most loyal first and second mate, I will instruct you on some common sense that will allow you to survive on this ship. After all, the captain will not lower himself in explaining such things to the newcomer. Are you ready, lady? Alice stupidly listened in on what the goat head had to say and even forgot what her original purpose was in coming. Eventually, her mind became such a dizzying mess that she could only subconsciously nod. Okay. Very well, then next are a few rules that the crew of the Vanished must know, which will help the newcomers adapt to the environment faster and accept the blessings from the great Captain Duncan and the Vanished. Ads by PubFuture. The goat head was obviously satisfied with Alice's answer because the pride from the goat head's mouth was growing in strides. First, Captain Duncan is the absolute master of the Vanished. He is always right, even if reality conflicts with Captain Duncan's wording, it is subject to Captain Duncan's judgment. Second, crew members can only move in the areas allowed by the captain. No one is ever allowed in the areas forbidden by him. N.O.V.L.B. in .c. Ohm. Third, if you step into an unauthorized area and are lucky enough to survive temporarily, you must stay there until the captain comes for you. Otherwise, only death awaits the foolish ones. You are absolutely not allowed to return without permission. Fourth, the Vanished is always sailing on the right course. Do not question the captain's plan. If you find that the scenery around the Vanished is different from what you expected, or if the ship fell into a deeper part of the sea, it's also part of the normal voyage. Fifth, the captain will occasionally leave the ship, but he will certainly return. During the captain's departure, the Vanished will continue to sail as planned. Also, crew members are not allowed to go near the helm station at the stern during that period. The rudder system is insecure when the captain leaves, so the cables there will strangle any daredevil that shows signs of usurpation. Sixth, on the Vanished, there are basically only 6 rules for the crew. Seventh, the door to the captain's quarter only opens outward. The goat head seems to have popularized this common sense to the new crew more than once. It sounded so natural and smooth that Alice had to take a second to notice the conflicting information. Wait. Mr. Goathead, you just said there are only 6 articles. Sixth, on the Vanished, there are basically only 6 rules for the crew. The goat head replied at once and repeated his words. Alice wondered if one of them had broke somewhere, but you just mentioned the 7th article. Seventh, the door to the captain's quarter only opens outward. The goat head answered very naturally. Alice stared at the goat head with a face of WTF. After a bit more doubt, she finally confirmed this must be how things work on the Vanished. Don't you think it's contradicting? There is no contradiction. Listening to the goat's determined answer, Alice eventually stuffed the question back down after meeting those obsidian black eyes. There are some things better left unsaid, even a doll knows that. Chapter 23 Inches Bird. Alice doesn't know much about this world, but at the very least, she had enough awareness through the whispering conversations from those who guarded her that supernatural things are to be vigilant of. If an event was clearly irrational yet existed realistically, then the first rule of safety was to analyze the situation while maintaining a safe distance. Since the goat head said there are only 6 crew rules, so be it. As for the 7th, nothing was stopping her from remembering it as well. But she still had some doubts. Just now, I tried pushing the door of the captain's room. Why does it only open outwards and needs emphasizing in the rules? The goat head stared silently into Alice's eyes, and after 2 full seconds, he spoke so sternly and concisely that it was shocking. Sometimes, it can open inward. That, if you see the door open inward, don't go in, for on the entire Vanished, only the captain is qualified to do so. Alice was startled by the other's extraordinarily solemn attitude. However, the goat head's tone briskly changed yet again in the next. All right, the necessary introduction for the new crew member has ended. Now let's talk about something else. Oh yes, lady, what's your purpose in coming to the captain's room? If you are unfamiliar with the facilities on the ship, then there is no need to bother the great Captain Duncan. But you came to the right place if you want someone to talk to. I am very good at finding topics and know countless great stories about this ship. Are you not interested in its great deeds? I can also introduce you to the most famous dishes on the boundless sea, and I know a little about cooking too. Looking for more content? We may have what you want. Looking for more content? We may have what you want. Discovery feed. Ads by PubFuture. Alice tried several times to interrupt the goat head during his long spiel, and it was already too late when she realized something was wrong. Anomaly 099, the puppet Miss Alice, faces the second greatest horror on the Vanished today besides Captain Duncan. At the same time, in the bedroom, which was separated from them by only one wall, Duncan quietly listened to the movement coming from the mapping room. He had just woken up when the conversation first began, so he didn't interrupt the pair. Thankfully so, otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to hear about the crew codes and the door to his bedroom opening outwards. So, the ship's real Captain Duncan would have also pushed open the door to the captain's cabin and headed for some mysterious world. And this happened more than once that the goat head presumed this as a matter of course. November LBJNN. The news was good for Duncan, which meant he didn't have to worry about returning to the other side later. This way, it won't look odd when more crew members arrive. But on the other hand, Duncan also had an inevitable worry in mind. It had to do with the 6+1 crew code that the goat head deliberately mentioned. What exactly do these crew codes mean? From the surface, it sounded grotesque, dangerous, and even contradictory. However, the truth couldn't be further from that. It's clearly meant to restrict the crew's behavior while on board so that they could survive in some dangerous environment. Duncan frowned at the idea, trying to judge his own place among these codes. He's undoubtedly the adjudicator of some of these risks and seemingly with the greatest freedom on the vessel. But that's under the premise he's the real Captain Duncan. Personalized content tailored to your preferences, all in one place. Personalized content tailored to your preferences, all in one place. Discovery feed, ads by PubFuture. This was the most worrying part. But he suddenly remembered his own exploration on the Vanished, and the fact that he was walking around the cabin at will. The goat head never reminded himself of the crew code and saw himself as the real Captain Duncan. Based on this fact, the dangers mentioned by the goat head may not necessarily be true for himself. Duncan exhaled softly and continued to listen in on the conversation, only to regret he couldn't turn off his ears half a minute later. Round 1 of the battles between the silly doll versus the annoying goat head commences. Who's going to overwhelm the other one? First, it was the doll's nonsensical blabbing of the wind and waves from Alice, then, it's the annoying yapping of the goat head in return. No matter how much Duncan wanted information, such an attack on his conscience wouldn't be good. However, right as he's about to head out of his bedroom to stop the two, he stops. Duncan had just finished a miraculous soul journey, and there was plenty of intelligence he needed to sort and sum up. Why should he interfere when both parties were clearly enjoying each other's company? This gives him an excuse to stay in his bedroom while not paying attention. Silently saying sorry to Miss Doll, Duncan shifted his attention down to his right hand where he froze up. The brass compass, which was slightly larger than a pocket watch, had disappeared at some point without him realizing it. Duncan's eyes were momentarily troubled, for this was the first time he eased up his awareness since arriving on this strange eerie ghost ship, a mistake that could have been lethal. The next second, he flicked his finger to pop a puff of green flame out. He wanted to use his connection with the ship to scan for any abnormal entities hiding in his bedroom, but in the instant of getting up, a subtle connection suddenly emerged from the bottom of his heart. Out of reflex, he looked up and saw several illusory feathers falling down from the air. Amazed by this finding, Duncan stared even harder and saw what it was, a phantom figure rapidly emerging from the void. It was about 3 or so seconds later, but the black phantom had become a snowy white thing. Specifically, a dove that had the missing compass hanging from its neck. There's also a new obsidian knife lying quietly next to the bird's feet. Chapter 24 Inches Dove. Duncan stared at the white dove with a somewhat stunned face, which the pigeon also returned with an equally stunned expression. It was not easy to see the expression on a bird's face, but somehow, Duncan got this inkling sensation he could. There's wisdom in those slightly reddened bird eyes, and the 2 green irises were clearly reflecting his image. Dove. After stalling for several seconds, Duncan finally started to mutter something under his breath. Why a dove? Why did a dove suddenly pop up? Why is my brass compass still hanging on this bird's neck? How did that dagger come about? All in all, 1,000 words could be summed up in one sentence. Can something normal happen for once on this abnormal ship? And when Duncan's side was full of question marks and complaints, the dove that had been there for half a day seemed to have finally woken up. Nodding its head and taking 2 steps forward on the table, the bird stretched its neck up at Duncan's direction and made a loud, goo-goo, sound. Duncan stared wordlessly at this, somehow coming up with the image of a classical pirate captain from his memories. Having a bird on my shoulder does fit that picture, but shouldn't it normally be a parrot instead? So what's the deal with a white dove? The bird seemingly overheard the remark and nodded its head again. Then, to the captain's dismay, the dove spoke with a strange and feministic voice, "Teleportation is complete." Any sort of murmuring and thought instantly vaporized from Duncan's side. Nearly choking from his own saliva at the shock, he glared at the white dove with a confused expression and a sense of déjà vu from when he first met the goat head. But this was not the first day he came to the vanished. After the brief surprise, he immediately regained his composure and summoned up a puff of green flame from one hand and stared at the bird with a guarded posture. "Where are you from?" The dove tilted its head, one eye looking straight at Duncan, the other up at the ceiling. "The address is wrong. Please reconfirm the address again, or contact the system administrator." Looking for more content? We may have what you want. Looking for more content? We may have what you want. Discovery feed. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan. Compared to his expression's momentary sluggishness, a bigger wave of shock had set off in his heart. "NOVELBJN.C ohm. This dove had said something, not of the style from this world. No one should be speaking like this here, not Alice, not the goat head, and absolutely not the hooded cultists from his soul journey. The term should only be familiar to someone like him, Zhou Ming, an earthling. However, the bird did not seem to notice the change between Duncan's eyes and expression at all. Pecking its winging for a quick clean, the dove started to pace freely around the table until it ran up to the obsidian dagger used by the cultists. Then, speaking with the same strange and feministic voice like before, "Take up this solar tomahawk and embrace the glory of battle." Duncan jerked up from his desk and caused the chair underneath to tip over backward, making a harsh crashing sound as a result. The reason? Because the phrase "there was not of this world." Perhaps due to the loud commotion, Duncan suddenly got a direct inquiry from the goat head. "Captain, are you okay?" Still staring at the dove on the table, he replied calmly since the goat head wouldn't peek into his personal quarter, "I'm fine. Miss Alice has come to see you. Do you want to? You meet with her first." "Yes, Captain." Duncan exhaled heavily and then glanced back at the door leading out to the mapping room. Immediately, the bombardment of stupid topics continued with the wooden statue and Alice, the latter trying multiple times to get up and leave only to be stopped by the former. He promises to apologize to the doll later, but for now, this earthling has more important matters to attend to. Ads by PubFuture. Taking a seat back in front of his desk, Duncan wanted to try communicating with the dove when he suddenly noticed a detail he hadn't noticed until now. A strand of fire was vaguely stretching out from his right finger and connecting to the bird's wing. This made Duncan frown. He thought about what this meant, then as a test, he flicked his right hand. Next thing he knew, the bird had disappeared in an instant and reappeared on his shoulder, pecking his hair while making a goo-goo sound. Raising an eyebrow, he flicks his finger again to test the theory. Sure enough, the dove disappears and reappears on the table. However, unlike the last, the compass hanging around the bird's neck radiated a green glow this time. Duncan frowned. Is it related to this brass compass? There's certainly a connection between the dove and himself, even closer than the connection between him and the vanished, which might also explain why the bird knew about that phrase from Earth that only he knew. Now the question was, why did this dove appear now? Going back and forth in his mind, Duncan eventually focused in on the spooky brass compass. From testing the ghost fire to the present, everything had begun with this compass. Whether it was the previous soul journey into the corpse, the item's disappearance, or the dove's emergence, it's all sourced from this compass. Determined to find out why, Duncan reached out for the item to study. The dove was surprisingly unaversive to his touch. However, instead of feeling the metallic hardness, his finger directly went through the compass and touched the feathers instead. The dove jumped a few times in place at the tickle, exclaiming wildly in protest, "Today is KFC Crazy Thursday, half price." Twitching in the corner of his eye, Duncan tried several more times at this gesture. Eventually, he concluded the compass wasn't coming off and had obviously been bound to the dove. Or rather, maybe the compass's real body was the bird itself. Duncan had no way to confirm his speculations at the moment, but for now, he needed an excuse to settle this dove on the ship. After a short thought, he decided to give the bird a name first. "I've got to give you a name," he said with a light tap of his finger on the table. "I suppose you can understand me, right?" The bird tilted its head, and the two mung bean-sized eyes stared at Duncan wistfully. Chapter 25 Inches Communication is impossible. The dove tilted its head, probably feeling that Duncan hadn't heard her clearly. then quickly repeated the name again in a louder voice than before, I. Duncan finally understood what the bird meant. You mean your name is I? The dove nodded proudly and paced around the desk. Goo-goo. Duncan couldn't help but rub his forehead over how strange it was communicating with this dove. It's even more awkward than speaking with the goat head in his opinion. Do you know how you were born? Or rather, how did you end up here? The dove thought for a moment before both of them looked in different directions. Aya, the page you're looking for is missing, try refreshing it. Duncan. It's nearly impossible to comprehend what was happening in the bird's head. But one thing's certain, the bird was sentient in its own way and communicated seriously. The problem was, did they both have the same understanding of what communication actually meant? Duncan continued his effort to talk with this dove called I. Throughout their conversation, the bird gave a relevant answer to his questions on occasion. However, most replies were incoherent messes that didn't relate. In the end, little progress was made, leaving the captain frowning. What kind of messed up thing is this? Unfazed by the displeasure from the human, the dove crouched down on the table and started roosting while occasionally nagging for V50. Duncan didn't care about the bird's chanting, instead curled his fingers and rubbed them gently. As he watched the glowing green flame on his fingertip, the guy was sure of one thing: the compass and dove were essentially an anomaly item that he could control. NOVELBJN.C ohm. Putting it to the test, he raised the size of the flame's intensity. Sure enough, the flame around I blew up with the pointer inside the compass beginning to slow down like it wanted to point in some direction. I didn't react the whole time though, despite being engulfed in fire, merely just bathing itself in the ghost fire and awaiting orders. Ads by PubFuture. Then before the brass compass could be fully activated, Duncan took the initiative to disperse the flames. Silently summing up his findings. First, the compass can still be used, it's just that there is an extra weird medium now. For the time being, it is not certain what effect this dove will bring, nor should I go on another soul journey until I'm fully prepared. Secondly, there is definitely a connection between the dove and me, and this connection will become more pronounced in the case of the fire. To some extent, I can also control the dove, perhaps even go further than just control. I clearly has its own will and will act according to its own thoughts. Therefore, my orders are not absolute for her, which is different from the other items on the vanished. Can speak, has a certain ability to think, can judge problems independently. Compared with the ordinary anomalies, this dove's nature seems closer to that of the goat head. Duncan summed up some of the information now known to him and finally shifted his attention to that cursed obsidian black dagger. After a little thought, Duncan reached out and picked up the item, which the priest in that underground sewer used. The cold, hard touch at contact told him it was real. After confirming it's not another illusion, Duncan unleashed a little more of his ghost fire, causing the flames to wrap around the blade's body. Judging from the empty feedback, the extraordinary power contained within this ritual blade had indeed dissipated. As he had previously judged at the sacrificial site, this thing was not really an anomaly item but an extension of some extraordinary power or a temporary vessel, infused with energy artificially. Although Duncan did not know what kind of system the anomalies used, he could take a close guess that this blade shouldn't be a rare item, more like some mass-produced product. This is what you brought back. He lifted his head and faced I, and it's for me. The dove stared straight into Duncan's eyes with those reddish bean irises without replying. Duncan, ads by PubFuture, he asked again, and the dove still didn't move, as if it had suddenly become a lifeless sculpture. The sudden abnormal change made Duncan frown slightly, but just as he was about to stimulate I with the ghost flame to see if he could forcibly wake it up, the bird suddenly came alive. Jumping twice in place and shouting, "Take this solar tomahawk, take this solar tomahawk, take this." Okay, I get it. You don't have to answer every question I ask. Duncan quickly waved his hand to force the dove to quiet down. Organizing his language first, then do you know how you brought this dagger here? Or rather, you can carry physical objects through the space tunnel, right? The dove pondered for a moment before pecking Duncan's finger. The whole place is full, and the chicken pieces are free of charge. Duncan, I'll pretend to understand. He sighed, thinking he had reached the limit of communication with this bird. Then he got up from his desk and turned to face the door leading to the mapping room. He could still hear the exchanging conversation of the goat head and Alice outside, which was going on rather well with the former going over the 17th recipe for kelp stew. At this moment, Duncan felt compelled to save his only, and most normal crew member. On the other hand, he had been in the bed chamber for far too long. It's time he showed his face to reassure the goat head. But before leaving, he hesitantly glanced at I, who was running around the table again. Do I want to take this dove out too? How do I explain it to them when I do? Duncan hesitated for only 2 seconds before decisively grabbing the dove and placing it on his shoulder. If he's going to be active on the Vanished for the foreseeable future, he would need to be more open about certain secrets. Also, hiding a speaking, walking bird on the ship would never end well. What would the other crew members think of his image if they suddenly came across I one day? So, he might as well graciously take the dove out and say it was his new booty. He didn't need to explain anything to the goat head in the first place. After all, the first mate of this ship would fill in the details on his own regardless. As for the strange stories that this dove pops up from time to time, the locals in this world would find it incomprehensible anyway. That doesn't need to be explained either. Let the goat head and Alice find a way to make up for it. With the fat dove on his shoulder, Duncan freely straightened his posture and calmly walked out of the bed chamber. Authentic good herbal tea, authentic good voice, welcome to watch. The dove proudly straightened its chest as well and shouted as if announcing its entry. Chapter 26 Inches Starless Night. Honestly speaking, Duncan found it hard to keep his calm no matter how thick his skin was when the dove spoke over his shoulder. Why can't I have a normal parrot like those pirate captains from the movies? If not, a monkey will do too. But he had already pushed open the door to the mapping room, meaning it was impossible to turn around. Right now, the goat head was happily chanting away about the 12th legend of the fish stew in his repertoire when Duncan interrupted his noisy blabbing. Captain, you're finally out. I must tell you, Miss Alice is such a wonderful conversation partner. I haven't had such a good conversation in years, you know. Duncan directly ignored the goat head's loud blabbing and turned to face the victim sitting across the table, whom had placed her own head on the table with those hands firmly pressed against the ears. Duncan, she pulled her head off herself, the goat head explained without waiting for Duncan to speak, though I don't know why she did it. How powerful is the nagging of the goat head to make a cursed doll behead herself to avoid the sound waves? At the same time as Duncan was shocked, the goat head had also noticed the strange bird brought out by the captain. His obsidian black eyes were staring hard at I. Captain, on your shoulder is. She's called I, and it's my pet from now on, Duncan said with as little detail as possible to avoid possible loopholes. Your pet? The goat head obviously froze for a moment, and then it acted as if it's come to a decision. I did sense your departure from the Vanished earlier. You take a spirit walk. This must be the loot you brought back from the trip into the spirit world. Spirit walk, ads by PubFuture. Duncan immediately brought up the image of the compass in his head over this new term. Considering how he had just experienced a soul projection for himself, this must be something commonly done by the real Captain Duncan. Nodding his head indifferently, I went out for a stroll. The goat head promptly chased the reply with compliments. Truly worthy of the great Captain Duncan, even a simple spirit walk can bring back treasures. Is this a dove? If it can become your pet, then it must be something extraordinary. You even hung your compass on it. Is this, of course, your decision and judgment are always correct. But what is special about this dove? Is it? Picking up on a key point from the goat head's flattery, Duncan realized the compass must be an important treasure to the real captain. Otherwise, this statue wouldn't have put so much emphasis on the item. But nothing he could do now. The compass was bound to the dove, and, according to the feedback of the ghost fire, the dove seemed more like the real body of the compass than vice versa. Thinking fast with an unwavering expression, Duncan was trying to come up with something to say when I suddenly jumped off his shoulder and flew in front of the goat head with its flapping wings. Want to charge Q coin or no? The bird pecks the statue and asks. Duncan, an anomaly with intelligence. The goat head was also stunned by how it spoke. This dove can talk. Duncan immediately gave a euphemistic reminder, you can also talk. Like words, like words, like words, the dove eye paced around the table and spoke to no one in specific. Duncan snapped his fingertips as he saw this, and with the sudden flicker of green flame, the dove pacing on the table disappeared in a blink of an eye and returned to the shoulder. Yes, it's an intellectual anomaly, and it is under my direct control. Duncan nodded to the goat head. Is there any problem? The goat head hurriedly replied, of course not, there is no problem at all. Everything is as the great Captain Duncan wills it. N-O-V-E in .c ohm. Ignoring the goat head before the conversation overextends itself, Duncan turns to face Alice. Patting the doll on the shoulder. Wake up, wake up. Ads by PubFuture. Alice's body stirred over the intervention. As if awakened from a long nightmare, she started to stammer some words while trying to speak. Cap, cap, cap. Duncan. Put your head back on first. Widening her eyes as it hit her, Alice hurriedly plopped her own head back on the neck with an audible click. Only then did her speech return to normal. Ah, Captain, you are back. Just now it seems to have, Mr. Goathead is finished. The statue on the table immediately chimes in. No, we were just about to go over the legend regarding the fish stew. The next topic is... Shut up, Duncan sternly orders. Okay. Alice visibly shook when the Goathead attempted to continue. It's quite apparent she's been horrified by the experience and showed fear in her eyes. In fact, Duncan had the strong speculation that Miss Doll here wouldn't want to step into his quarters again for the next while. Thinking of this, he finally got back to the main subject. What did you need? Alice's expression was a little dull, as if her original goal of visiting the captain's quarter had been forgotten with the conversation between her and the statue. Then a few seconds later, yes, I wanted to ask if there's a place to take a bath on the ship. I got soaked with seawater before, so my joints are a bit uncomfortable. At the end, the expression on Miss Doll's face was blushing red with embarrassment. In hindsight, Duncan also felt embarrassed over the matter. He did, after all, throw the lady overboard several times. Unchanging in his voice, is that all? Alice sat reservedly in her chair. Yes, that is all. For many ocean-going ships, fresh water is an extremely valuable resource, so bathing is a luxury that needs restraint. Duncan said solemnly at first, but then suddenly formed a smile. But you are lucky, the Vanished is not an ordinary ship, so fresh water is not a problem here. Come with me. There is a bathing place in the cabin below the middle deck. To get there, you have to go through the upper deck first. Alice stood up at once. She really didn't want to spend another second in this room with the Goathead. You continue to take the helm, Duncan glanced back and ordered. After he had finished his explanation, the pair soon came out to the main deck where the night sky was abnormally clear today. Unlike in the past, the world was always gloomy with dark clouds hovering over his head. This time around though, he could see as far as the eye could see, which was a lot. For example, there weren't any stars up there, or a moon for that matter. Instead, there's only a gaping crack of faint glowing grayish-white running across the world from end to end. If he had to describe this image, it would be someone cutting open a wound across the heavens and leaving it there. Chapter 27 Inches Insufficient Reserves of Common Sense of Life. In a sense, this starless, moonless sky with only a scar had more of an impact on Duncan than the imprisoned sun, with those rune rings around it. Because no matter how abnormal the sun was, it only shone down on the world under his feet. A star out of billions of stars in the galaxy. As long as this remains true, it means the world was somehow connected to the Earth, his home world. But this though, there's no celestial body at all. He couldn't even discern if there was a distance from here to Earth anymore. Duncan didn't say anything over his own woes and just stared up at the glowing crack. He had a lot of questions that had no answers. November LBJNN. Where are the other planets? Do they even exist over here? Or is it, the world beneath my feet is a celestial body located in a cosmic vacuum, and its distance from other stars is so far away that the night sky here is pitch black and starless? What is the pale scar that stretches across the sky? Is it a torn gap in space? Is it a touchable celestial structure? Or is it just an illusion floating above this treacherous expanse of the sea? Captain. Finally, a voice awakened Duncan from the side. Alice with his stammering and nervous voice, are you okay? Is the weather about to change? Is a big storm coming? I've heard seafarers mention this outside my box. It's nothing, Duncan said softly and then withdrew his gaze from the sky while repeating the phrase, it's nothing at all. Then Duncan stepped forward, his expression calm as if nothing had happened. Let's go. I'll take you to the cabin. You can wash up there later if you need to. Once again, the world has shown outsiders its weirdness with no seeming end to this either. Duncan had realized that he didn't know how many more shocking visions awaited him in the future, and if he made a fuss every time, he would probably only be left with astonishment in his life. If there was any experience he has accumulated over the past few decades of life on Earth, there's one that was most useful today. Ads by PubFuture. If a problem exists, find a way to solve it, since it wouldn't disappear on its own because of one's denial, just as the grotesque sky in front of you would not become a starry appearance because of his doubts. No matter how absurd and strange the phenomenon was, This was an irrefutable objective fact since everything existed here. Not understanding why was his problem, not this world. Nevertheless, what he has now is time, and there's plenty of it as the captain of the Vanished. Alice didn't know the reason for the captain's silence along the way, only that the atmosphere around Duncan had suddenly become somewhat depressed. But after reaching the targeted cabin, this oppressive feeling abruptly disappeared again. The place arrived at was a place one could bath, a bathroom specially prepared for upper seafarers on this classical ship. Under no circumstances are normal sailors permitted inside due to the harsh living conditions on this vessel. After all, sail-powered ships from the ancient era were not well equipped due to their limits, often seeing spoiled food and poor medical treatments on board. If not for the industrial age, such harsh challenges would continue to this day as a plague on seafarers. But ironically, on this ghost ship whom everyone fears, such poor living conditions had been resolved entirely by the freshwater tanks automatically refreshing themselves. As for the food in the warehouse, there are no signs of spoilage either. That leaves only the health conditions of the crew. A ghost captain could never get sick, and Alice's spinal problem had nothing to do with the ship, so that's unrelated. The pipe next to the bath leads to the freshwater tank. You can fill the bin over there with it to wash, but there's no hot water due to the ship's limited condition. Keep this in mind. Duncan went ahead and introduced Alice to the other facilities and even took the chance to go over the mundane stuff he had experienced over the past few days. I'm fine as long as I can rinse some of my joints. Alice was not picky at all. She examined all of the things inside the bathroom with curiosity and nodded. I'm just a puppet, I don't have any desire for hot baths. Duncan nodded in understanding, then with a hesitant voice, speaking of which, do you know how to take a bath? Do you have this life experience? Alice paused for a moment, then said in a heavy voice, it should be okay. I'm only removing my joints to rinse them. I'll put them back right afterward. Duncan. The two stared at each other like they were both lost on what to make of this. Have you considered how to put yourself back together after dismantling? Duncan took the lead in breaking this awkwardness. He knew Alice had never done this before, so he needed to remind her of this fact. I can't help you regarding this. Ads by PubFuture. Alice. Now that you mention it, I strongly recommend against disassembling your joints often, Duncan reminded in a serious tone, even if your body structure allows you to do so. Alice was a little confused. Why? It's easy to lose them if they're dismantled. Duncan finally said what he worried about the most. Unlike in the movies, where a cursed doll never needs to worry about losing its body parts, a real moving doll must. Like a toy he had as a child. If he's careless for even a day, the likely chance of him finding the part will fall dramatically due to forgetting its placement. Speaking of this, he paused and added, your cervical spine problem is serious enough. Alice imagined the picture for a moment and shrunk her neck in the next. Ah, okay, I understand, I think I know what to do. That's for the best, said Duncan with a worried expression. Then before taking his leave, I have a lot of things to do, so try not to get into too much trouble. Okay, Captain, thank you, Captain, Alice said happily. But just as Duncan was about to walk out of the cabin, she suddenly spoke again, oh right, Captain. Duncan stopped and tilted his head slightly, what else? Captain, I suddenly feel like you're not so scary either. Alice looked at Duncan's back and carefully considered her words, Mr. Goathead said you are the most terrible captain on the boundless sea, the elusive scourge of all the shipping routes, but what? But I find that you're a good talker and a bit of a caring parent. Duncan didn't look back when he suddenly asked, where did you get the concept of family from? Do you have a family? Alice hesitated for a moment as she slowly shook her head, it seems there is not. Then don't bring up the topic of parents anymore. Stay on the ship honestly, and I will make arrangements for your living standards. Oh, all right, Captain. Chapter 28 Inches the Pale Night. Unlike in the novels, real life was different. Do cursed dolls need joint maintenance? Will Alice's frequent joint disassembly suddenly cause her to scatter when she walks in the future? Have the bacon and dry cheese on the ghost ship expired? Can't the superheroes who fight with the evil forces during the day find sleep during the night? Do the evil forces who fight with the superheroes go to the supermarket to buy things? The story never tells you this. Instead, the people in the story are always dressed perfectly in every episode. Duncan sighed, realizing the fact that surviving on this ship would require far more than just determination on his end. He also had to consider many other practical questions, especially after the crew had increased while the many materials needed for living remained stagnant. Thankfully, the ship had an unlimited supply of fresh water, but only fresh water. The ingredients stored in the food warehouse were not automatically replenished after consumption. Then again, the bacon jerky and hard cheese could hardly satiate his appetite anyways. Nevertheless, he will not complain when they're not rotted after being stored on board for over a century. On top of this, there's also an inadequate supply of alternative clothes for Alice. Though the cursed doll hadn't mentioned it, nevertheless, this won't do for him. At the very least, he needed more stuff to pass the hour during the down times. Sure, the boundless sea was vast and plentiful, but that doesn't mean it's easy for the Vanished to procure new supplies. For one, there's no port they could dock for repairs and supplies, let alone open communication with civilized society. Drifting so blindly on the sea forever was an inefficient means of exploration. Obtaining information about this world must be from the land. This was Duncan's deepest impression after walking through the spirit world. Putting that aside, even if it's for his own physical and mental health, he had to try to get more in touch with the city-states and civilized society of the world. Otherwise, he worries he might truly become twisted and gloomy like a real ghost captain. Ads by PubFuture. Thinking of this, Duncan turned his head slightly and looked at the dove who was obediently roosting on his shoulder and combing her feathers. His main focus remains on the compass hanging around the bird's neck. The dove tilted its head to look at its master, and coldly said, "Set up the base. Spread the pores. Hey, do you know how to operate or not?" November LBJNN. Duncan went silent for a moment over those words. The bird usually spouted unrelated nonsense, but she does occasionally utter some useful helpful stuff like right now. Although spirit walking does come with the risk of uncertainty and accidents like tagging along in the return, Duncan knew he must do so soon nonetheless. Not only to gather intelligence but also to verify and master a useful ability. If she can bring back the ritual blade, can she bring back more? What are the rules and restrictions on what this bird carries? Can this process be controlled artificially? After pondering for a moment, Duncan decided to ask the bird directly, "Do you know how you brought that dagger back?" The dove thought for a moment and said in a deep tone, "Insufficient crystals mines." Duncan, that's enough. He's giving up on communicating with the bird for the time being. It's too much of a headache. Besides, what could be better than to personally test the theory out on his next trip? Inside the cabin, Alice finally figured out how to use the pipe for fetching water. She also managed to learn how to wash with the cold water. But for a doll, the cold temperature wasn't a problem at all. However, before jumping into the tub, Alice decides to greet everything in the cabin first. She patted the huge oak barrel, knocked on the pillar that supported the cabin, tapped the floor under her feet with her toes, and tiptoed up to pull the ropes and hooks hanging from the roof. "Hello, my name is Alice," she greeted the inanimate things happily, the same way she greeted the goat-headed gentleman from before. "I'm going to live on this ship from now on." Nothing in the cabin responded to her greeting, but Alice didn't care in the slightest. Ads by PubFuture. The goat-head said the Vanished was a living vessel, including the many things aboard. Although none of them seemed to have true intelligence, like that of the goat-head, or the ability to communicate, this did not prevent Alice from treating the entire Vanished as a neighbor who needed to be greeted. The Vanished was a living object, and so was she. Convinced that her greeting was polite and decent, Alice's mood became more pleasant, and then she shed her ornate dress and awkwardly climbed into the oak barrel that had been filled with water. The first step was to remove her head and rinse it since the joints around her neck aren't very strong. It's a reasonable choice in Miss Doll's mind, removing her head. The late pale night has finally descended upon the city-state of Planned, bringing an end to the hustle and bustle of the city. It's time to sleep for this prosperous pearl of the sea. But in the quiet darkness, the night watchman remains on alert, watching and protecting those who slumber. On the big clock tower, the tallest building in the city, a tall young woman with long grayish-white hair stands in front of the window overlooking the city. The lady's facial features were top-notch, but a noticeable scar across her left eye marred her beauty. As a woman, she's definitely on the tall size, higher than most men around here, and she was obviously well-trained with healthy proportioned muscles in that armored dress. Also, the lady brandished quite the sword on her waist. Inscribed with runes symbolizing the waves, the blade embodied her faith. Meanwhile, the sound of mechanical operation could constantly be heard behind the lady. Steam engines, the grinding of rods, and the pumping of pistons, these are all the mechanical marvels running this magnificent clock tower overseeing the entire settlement. Judging by the sound, This large and sophisticated machine was in good working order, and no evil forces were invading the sacred steam core tonight. But a faint uneasiness still plagued Inquisitor Vanna's heart. She believed something terrible would happen for some reason, and she was doomed to failure in stopping it. Eventually, footsteps from the direction of the stairs caught the lady's attention. It's a priest carrying a copper incense burner to replace the already used one hanging up on the guardrails. Once done with his work, the faithful made sure the smoke from the incense floated smoothly into the air and around the gears before whispering the name of the storm goddess. Then turning to face Vanna, "Good evening, Your Honor, are you personally taking the night watch again? I keep having this bad hunch over the past few days, especially tonight." "Bad hunch? In what direction?" The priest looked up, his heavy eyes concerned. "The storm goddess gave you an omen." "Not a clear message." The young female inquisitor shook her head. "I vaguely feel that there's something close to the city." Chapter 29 Inches Those who protect the city. The gods of supreme power dwelled in the bedrocks of this world, watching their followers' actions with a transcendental gaze using this connection. In return for this privilege, devout believers who acted in God's name would gain the ability to glimpse into the future and the direction it takes. This kind of voyeurism was not bound by time and space and implied the risk of being eroded by subspace. But for those determined and devout believers, this dangerous and powerful force was what allowed them to protect the fragile light of civilization in this endless ocean. For this pious inquisitor, a similar foresight had replayed itself in her dreams for many days now. She saw the boundless sea stained with a layer of ink with thunderous noises coming from the depths. Then with a loud splintering crack, the ocean splits apart in two, revealing a terrifying trench that reaches the very seabed. From within came a huge burning ship, rising from the depths into the air, its course, the city of Planned. Her home. In Inquisitor Vanna's life so far, the omen of such sheer scale has appeared only twice. The first occurred during her childhood when she awoke from a blood-soaked nightmare and then lost her parents in a cultist attack. That incident left her scarred on the face for life. The second time had occurred 4 years earlier when she saw a dark sun rising from beneath the city grounds. That foresight led her to wipe out the biggest stronghold of the sun god cultists hidden within the city. Now she finally got her third foresight. A flaming ghost ship was returning from the ocean's depth and would bring forth an indescribable giant into the world. So, she had lied to her fellow priest here tonight. The omen wasn't vague at all, it was so clear that she couldn't sleep for days as a result. Ads by PubFuture. The priest hesitated for a long time before speaking again. "But you didn't receive any negative feedback from the Lord." "The goddess doesn't necessarily remind you of all the risks, and sometimes the tribulations are the test," Vanna said quietly. "Let's drop this subject. What news do you have about the Adventurers Association?" The priest immediately nodded. "Our mediator on the side of the association has just made contact using the relic inside their headquarters. But the communication device aboard the ship seems to have malfunctioned, so we're not able to speak to the captain yet. We can only determine the ship is approaching the coast of Planned at normal speed." They disappeared from the perception of the holy relic, then reappeared out of thin air away from the intended route. "We also can't make contact with the crew who had been tasked with transporting an anomaly object." Inquisitor Vanna's brow instantly furrowed at this detail because her intuition was raising all the red flags from years of experience. "I remember that ship is called the White Oak, right?" "Yes, White Oak, captained by Lawrence Creed, a member of the Adventurers Association. He's an experienced sailor. Due to the cargo they're carrying, the ship had reported to the church beforehand at city-state Rensa," said the priest while recalling what he knew. "By the way, the accompanying cleric aboard the ship is a registered priest of the Deep Sea Church." "Fellow brothers of the church, pray the situation is not too bad," said Vanna in a heavy tone. "In short, the situation of the ship is not quite right. The entire route from Rensa to Planned is in the stable zone, under the control of the Adventurers Association, but the ship managed to disappear from under the Holy Relic's watch. I suspect the White Oak had briefly left the fabrics of reality, or even entered places it shouldn't have. Inform the port guards that they are to keep an eye out for the ship. No one is allowed to disembark from the White Oak when it arrives until a full inspection is completed. Are the security forces aware of this yet? Rest assured, your uncle, the magistrate, has ordered the officials to control the perimeter around the port and has raised the alert level. From now on until the level is lowered, all ships entering and leaving Planned will be on standby at the West Dock." "That's good. Uncle has always been a cautious man," said Vanna, who finally relaxed a little with the tense expression on her face easing up. "We only need to make sure the common people inside the watch stay out of this matter." The priest looked into Vanna's pale gray eyes, carefully choosing the most appropriate wording. You think, is that ship already polluted? Adds by PubFuture. It is uncertain at this time, but even if a ship that has left the real world returns shortly thereafter, it is rarely unscathed. It may be that some items on the ship have unconsciously evolved into an abnormal item, or the crew's hearts have morphed into insanity. In the worst-case scenario, the real sailors had all been replaced by something entirely different. Regardless of the truth, any ship that came into contact with the supernatural must be treated with wariness. Alas, may that ship and its crew be all right. The priest could not help but put his hand across his chest and recite the name of the storm goddess. May the storm goddess shelter those who bravely challenge the sea. May they all be well, said Vanna softly. Then, lowering her eyes and whispering a blessing before following it up with a reminder, but if they are unfortunate enough to not be, well, we must also be prepared. Yes, I understand, the priest said solemnly. But just as Vanna was about to refocus her attention on the city outside the window, a rush of footsteps suddenly came from the direction of the stairs. The next moment, a guardian in a silver-rimmed uniform that showed a dagger insignia across the chest ran over. Inquisitor, we have found the underground sacrificial site of the cultists in the sewer. We also caught a group of those sun god believers. Vanna's expression instantly got serious. Those cultists who worship the dark sun. Wait, you said you found a sacrifice point, not a hiding place. How dare they hold another sacrifice? NOVELBJN.C Ohm. Yes, it was the site where the sacrificial ceremony was held. We found evidence that sacrifices had taken place, said the guardian quickly. We also found many victims in the crypt not far from the site, most of them having been sacrificed by gutting their hearts. It's just that something is not quite right at the site. Vanna saw a look of absurdity and confusion on the guardian's face. Without hesitation, this female inquisitor picked up her heavy sword, blessed by the storm goddess, from the side and carried it on her back. Pointing to the stairs, lead the way. I will personally go examine the situation. Yes, milady. The sound of the huge sword banging against Vanna's metal pauldron was constantly ringing along the staircase. By the time they arrived at the entrance, 2 steam walkers were already parked outside in the square, rearing and steaming for her to get on that spider-like body. Vanna wasted no time and jumped atop the closest walker's carapace. The huge machine resembled one of those steampunk contraptions that you would find in a book, but this was far more refined and well-designed through generations of improvement. Pure technological creations could hardly exert enough influence on anomalies or events, but a crushing fire would most certainly remove any heretic that hides in the shadows. Of course, this hybrid of spider and tank could not be used inside the sewers due to its limited space. However, acting as a blockade at the exit fitted its purpose. After all, a barrage of 8mm bullets blessed by the Lord would send any escaping heretic into the afterlife. Chapter 30 inches one hell of a messed up scene. While Inquisitor Vanna mused over the troubles ahead with the 2 drivers steering the hugely heavy mechanical spider, it soon folded its long metallic legs into its abdomen to allow the wheels underneath to glide it across the city streets. Cultists who worship the sun god are a big problem for modern civilization. Unfortunately, there was more than one similar plague out there. There are always malicious eyes thrown from the depths of subspace to the human world, and there are always those stupid mortals who would try to infect those ominous forces. Between this collusion of ancient gods and mortals, there are also twisted items, forbidden airs, and remnants of taint left from ancient times lurking in the depths of the city-state, always trying to move, always trying to pry the order of society apart. Of all these threats, the sun god's followers were the ones who most alarmed and troubled the protectors of Planned. They are not only cultists that randomly gathered together but the product of the lost history from the old world. Worst of all, these heretics had a structured faith in place, like the Church of the Deep Sea that Vanna was a part of. This faith revolves around the era of order, under the old sun, which was not only self-contained but even had a corresponding, true solar calendar. Of course, the calendar wasn't recognized by modern society. To these heretics, they are the descendants of an ancient civilization that has long been lost, and believe that the glorious ancient civilization will be revived one day. As the Inquisitor of the Deep Sea Church, Vanna was not interested in the heresies of the cultists, but she wouldn't ignore how stubborn and unified the followers of the sun god were in their goals. The fact that they could survive one blow after another over countless years told the threat they posed to the city. But their resurgence in Planned still surprised Vanna. Since that unprecedented blow 4 years earlier, the sun god believers here had been so badly wounded that, according to several investigations, the heretics must have moved their main members to the nearby island cities. Some are even believed to have moved farther north to the Frostport city-state, leaving only the stubborn few basically unqualified to be in the inner circle of the cultists. Ads by PubFuture. These minions hid in the sewers, relying entirely on their knowledge of the underworld and the little twisted blessing given to them by the Black Sun to evade the Guardians. For 4 years, their numbers got smaller and smaller, and all they could do was cling to what little they had to survive. But now, 4 years later, they suddenly gathered again and even dared to risk exposure to hold a sacrifice ceremony in the assembly hall. Who gave them the guts? Or rather, was something big going to happen in this city-state? What reason could be worth it for these heretics to risk being snuffed out for good? The vibration and noise of the steam core running in the mechanical spider's body eventually forced Vanna to put the wild thoughts away for now. The task force had just entered the industrial zone where huge steam and hydrothermal pipes straddled the factory buildings. These were like giant blood vessels, connecting building to building through the sky, a marvel of human ingenuity in this modern age. November LBJNN. This picture brought back some bad memories for her though. The weather was similar to this one all those years ago, quiet with a slight breeze. It should have been peaceful for the slumbering residents of the city. Yet, it was a bloodied night, a nightmare. Her uncle had escaped from the fire with her on his back, and the streets were filled to the brim with the walking dead. Even now, Vanna would feel sick to the stomach at the disgusting stench of chemical grease oozing from the pipes. Eventually, the flat road had ended and ahead was an abandoned area on the city's outskirts with potholes and undulating roads. The two mechanical spiders could no longer have it easy by using their wheels and instead stretched out those long spider legs to walk on this uneven path. It didn't take long for the squad to reach an abandoned sewer entrance where a team of 8 had already been on standby. They had cordoned off the nearby area to prevent unrelated personnel from approaching the entrance. Vanna greeted them before following the person in charge of the scene directly into the depths. Once past some winding corridors and grimy paths of filthy goo, Vanna finally arrived at the secret meeting hall where more guardians and priests were already hard at work in purifying the place. From what she saw, a makeshift altar was located in the middle of the assembly hall. The wooden stage seems to have been burned by flames from first glance, and on the high platform, one could see the blasphemous totem erected by the sun god cultists. The totem has been burned by the flames as well, but the basic structure remains intact. At the same time, about a dozen cultists were crouched on the ground with their hands tied. Most of whom were trembling in fear and muttering some blasphemous prayers. But with the ceremonial site destroyed and the storm goddess already paying attention to this spot, these heretical prayers held no weight anymore. Ads by PubFuture. Then not far from the altar, the remains of the victims found in nearby caves were carefully placed on linen cloths painted with runes. The morticians were examining the condition of each body and doing their job as expected. That leaves the priests from the church itself. These clerics are all currently walking around the altar with incense burners strapped to some copper chains and letting the white smoke wisp into the air that promptly turned an ominous black when drawing near the altar. This process would take away the pollution and slowly erode the grip of the black sun little by little. "Inquisitor, please come here. This is what we have found," said the young guardian as he pointed at the corpse closest to the altar. "Please be careful, the ground here is not very clean." Vanna walked straight to the corpses, and after seeing the situation of one of them, she subconsciously frowned. It was a cultist with a golden mask, no doubt the priest directly in charge of the sacrificial ritual on the blasphemous altar. "There's a terrible hole in his chest. What's going on?" Vanna frowned even harder. Did this fanatic get too excited at the end of the ceremony and sacrifice himself? I hadn't heard of cultists who worshipped the black sun doing such a custom. This is exactly what is strange and bizarre about this. He did not sacrifice himself, said the guardian who brought Vanna over. Shaking his head with a slightly odd expression on his face, according to the description of the cultists caught at the scene, their emissary was sacrificed by a sacrifice. Sacrificed by a sacrifice. Vanna suddenly raised an eyebrow. What is this crazy talk? It's indeed very much like crazy talk. The guardian spread his hands helplessly. In fact, by the time we arrived, most of the cultists here were already in a semi-mad state. Already in a semi-mad state. Yes, their sacrificial rituals obviously went terribly wrong. Many of them were infected with madness, and most had even begun to slash and kill each other. They all seemed to think of each other as if they were some kind of monster, occupied by a terrible existence. It's their frantic frenzy that alarmed the watchmen patrolling nearby, resulting in the exposure of this site, there were only a few left who could soberly answer our questions when we apprehended them. The ones that did insisted that the emissary had been sacrificed. Caught in the madness, hacking and killing each other, and think others are occupied monsters. Vanna's expression immediately became serious. Have you checked? Is it the result of being polluted by the black sun? There is no trace of outside contamination, but rather a spontaneous madness. The factors that cause the madness are rooted in their own mental world, said the Guardian. Then he raised his finger to a young lady in a long black dress walking among the cultists. Ms. Heidi has arrived. If it is confirmed that these cultists are not contaminated by the black sun, we can only think of a way to resolve the issue using hypnosis.